everyone. I'm Dee. This should be fun. A lot of pictures. The beginning is a little bit of like a high school review, plate tectonics, but then we'll get into a bunch of fun pictures of mushrooms. If you have any questions, feel free to just shout them out. It'll be more of a discussion. So Gondwana land. 2 years ago, me and Christian Schwartz led a tour to New Zealand, which Phil was on, and some other lovely people from Santa Cruz and all around. And we kind of explored biodiversity and fungi from New Zealand, and it's super different from here.
I can't see.
Is that better?
You're too tall.
And then we actually led another tour this year and just got back from it about 3 weeks ago. So we spent a good amount of time in New Zealand now. And then last year I was able to go to Patagonia, and I started noticing a lot of similarities. So that was kind of what started me looking into this whole Gondwana land idea. And tonight I just want to talk about basically the evolutionary histories and kind of the deep past that connects New Zealand and Patagonia and these places in the southern hemisphere. So what is Gondwana? You can see on this picture basically the southern half of Pangaea before Pangaea. We've all heard of Pangaea, right?
No.
We'll get to that in a second. But the southern half of Pangaea, when it split from the northern hemisphere, is called Gondwana land. And it's basically the precursor, the past version of the modern southern hemisphere. And New Zealand, Australia, Antarctica, Patagonia, all of those formed a coastline, as you can see right here. And they were connected, and they had a similar climate. The world was a lot warmer, so it was not as fractured and different as today. And thinking about these places from this evolutionary past is really important for understanding how different plant families, how different animals got to these places and have evolved in place today. So this is the high school review part. We're going to do a little bit of plate tectonics.
Please do.
So basically radioactivity, heat in Earth's core creates convection currents, and like in a convection oven, the heated mantle moves upwards and then cools and forms these currents. And if there's any geologists in the room, you can just tell me what I said wrong. But these currents move Earth's crust. So there are two types of crusts, the oceanic and continental crust. Oceanic crust under the oceans, it's weighed down by the ocean, so when it hits the continental crust, dives under. And the oceanic crust is formed at spreading centers in the middle of the oceans that basically form igneous rock and slowly spread outwards. And then they're destroyed when they hit the continents. And then that's a subduction zone, and you get a bunch of water being pushed under there, and the water vapor and the heated crust basically forms volcanoes. Yes?
Sorry. Exactly what does subduction mean?
I don't know if I have, yeah. So right here, the heavier oceanic crust, because it's weighed down by the oceans, it's being created at the center and being pushed out slowly. And then when that collides at a fault line with the continental crust, the only place it can go is under, basically.
Slips under it?
So
Is
it
that
slips
all it
under.
means?
Yeah, that's the subduction zone.
Thank you.
Yeah. And that's how we get like the Cascades, the Cascade Mountains. And the precursor to the Sierra Nevada was formed by an ancient subduction zone. And the continental crust is composed of the three major rock types that you think of today. It's thicker, it's more buoyant. And yeah, that's the basic overview. So that creates the continents. They're slowly moving. Yes?
When you say it's buoyant on like what's floating around down below, or like?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So it's the ocean is weighing down the oceanic crust, so it sits a little bit lower, and the continental crust is like sitting a little bit higher, right? And then kind of, I don't know exactly how to explain that, but it's on the mantle, and it's floating a little bit above the oceanic crust. basically the reason to think about this is what happens when the continents and the oceans collide. And this is another little example of that. So the oceanic crust hits the continent, dives under, a bunch of water vapor and heat is formed when it hits the mantle, and then it creates these volcanoes. So someone asked why we think this. So first of all, when you look at the map of the world, the continents fit together really well, like a puzzle, right? So that was kind of the first line of evidence when people started mapping the world. They realized that all these continents kind of look like they fit together. South America and Africa fit, like North America and Europe. And then people started to realize that there were similar fossils of plants and animals from similar time periods that match up along these puzzle lines. So that's another very convincing part of the piece of the puzzle. And there's kind of a good little drawing here of the different types of fossils that were found throughout when Pangaea was together and the continents before they split up. And there are different layers of geology. So when there were ice ages and there were big glaciers moving along the Earth, it basically created these patterns of different rocks being laid down on top of each other, and then created striations, these lines that where the glacier was moving. And geologists have been able to figure out and date rocks to certain times and realize, okay, these all connect in these ways, that we have another way of supporting this theory. And I'm just going to zoom out a little bit more and give a bit more context to this whole progression of how the Earth has been forming. So about 600 million years ago, primitive life existed, these kind of jelly-like ancestors of jellyfish, frond-like creatures that people thought were plants for a while, but they were kind of ancient animals. A little bit further, about 538 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion happened. So that's when basically all of the ancestors to modern animals arose and diversified. And fast forward a couple 100 million years, dinosaurs began to speciate around 245 million years ago. And then Pangaea starts breaking up and Gondwana forms. And at this point, it's a really large landmass, and it's basically dominated by warm, lush rainforest. So if you think of the southern hemisphere today, you go really south, it's super cold, super arid in some of those places, and you go further up and it's tropical. But you can imagine this time it was more similar throughout the whole system. And then as the earth changed and the climate changed and things split apart, things kind of evolved in different places. So yeah, Australia, New Zealand, Patagonia, Antarctica, they were connected. They shared similar plant species at this time. And then as Gondwana split off, they evolved their own endemics, species that only exist in those land masses from that point. And so getting to New Zealand now, or the Maori word for New Zealand is Aotearoa, and that basically loosely translates to land of the long white cloud. And as people who've gone on our trips can attest, it very much makes sense. There's a lot of clouds there. So Antarctica and Australia, when everything was splitting apart, they didn't split apart until about 45 million years ago. So they were kind of late on the train of splitting up. And then 83 million years ago, New Zealand split from Australia. And this is a really interesting timing because right around that time, mammals were starting to diversify in the northern hemisphere and making their way down. But a little bit before, or a little bit after New Zealand split from Australia, the mammals made it to Australia and they didn't get to New Zealand. So to this day, there are only two terrestrial mammals in New Zealand, and they're both bats. And the only other mammals are in the ocean. So New Zealand got a lot of interesting plants and animals from the Gondwanan lineage, the ancient species that exist there today that kind of evolved in place. That includes, I'll talk about them more in detail, but podocarbs, which are an ancient conifer, southern beach, which is kind of like their version of the northern hemisphere beaches, or kind of similar to oaks in a way. Tuatara, which is this creature. This looks like some other lizards or some other reptiles, but it's in its own order, its own family, its own order. So it's basically related to nothing that exists today. This is kind of an ancient relic, a living fossil. And there's a lot of unique insects. They have these massive crickets that hang out on the trees at night.
How big are they?
Some of them can be small and big. They call them weta. Yeah. And there's really interesting birds and frogs. They have just a lot of weird things happened when an island has been evolving in place for a long time without the influence from the rest of the world. So they have the only species of bird that mates facing each other is there. The only species of bird in the world that has a curved bill, which we got to see. And their frogs don't have a tadpole stage. The tadpole stage is internal, and then they basically give live birth. They have a type of duck that lives in only extremely fast raging currents that we didn't get to see. We looked for, we tried. And that duck, the males whistle and the females kind of yell. They don't quack. So a lot of weird stuff has happened there, which makes it really fun to go see what's going on. And the no native land mammals in New Zealand is very important because when we talk about Patagonia, they got mammals, right? So they're still connected to the rest of the Americas, and mammals made it down there and have diversified. So we'll talk about that more in a bit.
What kind of invasive mammals are in New Zealand?
A lot. It's also a big issue because a lot of the birds don't fly. They basically evolved to fill the role of mammals. So they're really vulnerable to rats were introduced, stoats, possums, rabbits, and they basically they're really, really bad for the native bird population. I think around 75% of the birds have gone extinct from New Zealand since people arrived there. And people have only been there for about 1,000 years. And so they have huge programs to trap and kill possums, basically. One time I was backpacking and met someone who's a possum trapper, and he said he killed 700 in a week. And I got to see the pile of them. It was
But they're really cute.
Yeah,
They're better looking than our possums.
they're really cute. They're Australian possums, and they're actually not doing super well in Australia, but in New Zealand they're
They flourish.
exploding. Yeah.
Picture of them?
Oh, I don't here. I can show it. I can show after. Yeah. What? So Patagonia is a little bit different. Similarly, it came from Gondwana, so it has has similar southern beech forests, Araucaria, which is similar to podocarps. It's an ancient conifer, like the monkey puzzle tree, which you may have seen. But it was attached to the mainland, so it got mammals, and mammals have diversified there. So it doesn't have the influence of lots of ground-dwelling birds like New Zealand. But it is attached to the mainland, but in a way you can think of it as an island, because on several sides it has an ocean, and to the top of it it's very tropical. So it's kind of this mountain range on the west coast that's dominated by glaciers that goes into this kind of high desert steppe. It feels really similar to the Sierra Nevada, the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. And so a lot of animals and plants and mushrooms are endemic to that section that's highlighted here. And that's just kind of what it looks like there. It's pretty amazing. And it's a landscape just dominated by huge expanses of ice, and massive mountains that are really dramatic. So just getting a little less technical, some of the similarities between the two that I noticed. They're both southern lands of the extreme, is how I like to think about it. They're really cold, really windy, really wet, and just very dramatic landscapes. So that's in southern Patagonia. That's in the tallest mountain in New Zealand. Weather is as the people who have come on these tours know, some of these places rain a lot. This is Milford Sound, which is one of the rainiest places on Earth. It rains over 180 days a year and can rain almost 10 inches in 24 hours. And we were talking about at dinner, it will rain that much, and this valley, which is it's technically a fjord, and there are these 5,000 foot peaks along this valley coming out of the ocean. If it's not raining, it has 2 permanent waterfalls, and then if it rains, there are several hundred. And it basically drains 10 inches of rain in a day down these cliffs. So it's really dramatic. And both times we were there, we got to see lots of rain. So that was fun. And there's this thing called that's the one of the permanent waterfalls. So there's this thing called the southern westerly wind belt, which basically circulates cold air around Antarctica in the southern hemisphere, and that kind of maintains on the west coast of New Zealand and Patagonia these glaciers that are in these mountain ranges, and it keeps it really cold. And it also leads to extreme winds. So when I was in Patagonia and backpacking once, my tent was basically flattened on me the whole night. It was so windy. And because they share an ocean, New Zealand and Patagonia have really similar sea life. So these are humpback whales in Argentina and as well in New Zealand. And they also have penguins. They both have penguins, different species of penguins. It's a little blue penguin in New Zealand. Yeah, they have these nesting boxes where you can open them up and peek in the top. They were closed when we were there. Yeah, and then they have penguins as well in southern Patagonia. You'll see lots of offshore rocks with cormorants nesting and gulls. And they both have albatross, which are these really dramatic birds with huge wingspans that cruise slowly around the southern oceans. And some endemic species we'll just talk about briefly. So this is the New Zealand alpine parrot, the kia. And a lot of the birds in New Zealand are named for the sounds they make. So it kind of flies high above you and makes the sound kia. And they're really beautiful, and they're restricted to the high alpine zone in New Zealand's South Island. And then in Patagonia, there's something that felt really similar. It's a parakeet that lives kind of in these alpine areas as well. There's some really weird things that have happened with springtails in New Zealand. So you guys might be used to picking up a mushroom and having a bunch of little springtails jump off, little critters. Some of the New Zealand springtails are extremely colorful and large. So, I mean, for a springtail, they're large, but they're probably about this big, and they kind of crawl around, and you can flip over logs and find them. And New Zealand doesn't have any mammals, but there are a lot of mammals in Patagonia that are really interesting. This is the culpeo, which is it looks like a fox, but it's actually a relative of wolves. And these kind of come up to you and beg you for food. They're very cute. Okay, so we'll get into the southern beech forest, which is kind of the place you want to mushroom hunt in New Zealand and Patagonia. So they're the Gondwanan influence. They are an ancient lineage that was the ancestors to the southern beech who were around when Gondwana was together. And now they've kind of slowly moved to these places that are cooler in both Patagonia and New Zealand. And there's also some species in Australia. And in Patagonia, some of the species are deciduous. They lose their leaves like this one here and turn red and kind of cover the whole hillside in these beautiful fall colors. But New Zealand, all of them are evergreen. They are really important because they're ectomycorrhizal. They host a huge diversity of mushrooms, and that's kind of the main place we were looking for ECM fungi in New Zealand. And then they also have some interesting parasites and associations that we'll talk about. But this is kind of what the forests look like. This is a species in Patagonia. And then when you get higher in altitude, they kind of form these smaller, dwarfed versions of these forests. In New Zealand, they call them goblin forests because they'll be covered in moss and the trees will be about this high. But then they'll host all the similar mushrooms up in that habitat. And then these are the fall colors, and they're changing colors. and some southern beaches clinging to the edge of Milford Sound. So these are what the leaves look like. There are about 5 species in New Zealand. We mainly saw these 3. Some of the forests feel similar to oak forests, but they're more closely related to beaches that you'd find in the East Coast or Europe. And okay, we're getting into mushrooms now. So Soteria are these really interesting kind of weak pathogens that grow on these southern beech trees. And we didn't get to see them in any of the New Zealand tours because we were too late. They fruit in spring and early summer. And they form these large galls. So the fungus itself, the fruiting body, are these white things, and then the large gall just keeps building tissue on every year as they fruit. And these growths kind of form these cavities, and some of the branches rot out, and they're really important for nesting birds. And then the birds also eat some of the fungi and distribute the spores. So it's this interesting relationship. But that's mostly happening in Patagonia because a lot of the New Zealand birds are ground dwelling and they don't fly. And these have been traditionally eaten for a long time, mostly in Patagonia. That's where they've been documented as being eaten, and that's where people eat them today. There is not much information on if people eat them in New Zealand. But you can eat them raw.
Are they tasty?
They're sweet.
Yeah, they're sweet. In Patagonia, they call them pan de indio, like Indian bread. You can just eat them raw.
Is it wheat because it's usually non-lethal?
Yeah, so they don't kill the trees, but it appears they're taking from the trees. It's not as much of a symbiosis, it's more of like a weak parasitism. They might kill a branch. And that's what they look like. They kind of just are all over the landscape in the spring, and they're fruiting all over their trees. They're very beautiful. And that's a different species, a smaller one.
So what's their function?
They're doing. I mean, they're a parasite, so their function in comparison to the beech trees is they're taking nutrients from the tree, and they're fruiting. They're feeding birds. They're creating habitat for birds and people. Yeah, I think they're in a delicate balance with the whole ecosystem. Yeah. This is Alison Pollock's photo. Phil might remember this day. Alison, I don't know if you guys know her, she's amazing macro photography. She came on her first tour, macro photographer. And she kind of sits in one place for the whole day and picks apart little logs and finds really tiny things to take photos of. So these are probably 2 millimeters tall. And this is a genus called Brahmaculus, which grows in association with beech trees, mostly on their roots and mostly in these caves underneath. When an old beech tree forms a little like cave underneath some moss, you'll find these little things. So this is an interesting story. When we were in one of our places on the tour, the first tour, Allison found these and was exclaiming and freaking out and so excited because they're so beautiful. And we didn't have any permits to collect. So we took photos, put them on iNaturalist, and pretty soon this guy Peter, the ascomycete expert for New Zealand, had reached out to us. And we're like, where are those? We have to go find them. And he actually went down and looked for them, and Allison gave him the exact coordinates and everything, and couldn't find them. But then this time, I went to the New Zealand fungal foray and was lucky enough to find it again. So now we have a collection of it, and this guy Peter thinks it's a new species. And they're really tiny. So this is a spider web, and this is like the root of a nothofagus sticking out. And then there's a described species, this one, which was growing in the same area, called Brahmaculus moonlighticus. And they're these really beautiful, interesting things. They grow basically only in places where there's southern beach, so this Gondwana influence. And can anyone guess what family it's in? What it's related to? Just shout out something.
Yes.
It's related to Chlorosiboria. It's in the Chlorosiboriaceae.
I was just gonna say.
Which is something you see around here, the thing that turns wood, this kind of turquoise color. But yeah, they don't look very similar. Another thing about these southern beech forests is they have an extreme abundance of Cortinarius, which is so fun for people who like to identify mushrooms. If you were walking around in an oak forest here, you'd find a good amount of Cortinarius, but there, you basically only find Cortinarius. You'll find 20 species of Cortinarius and then one Russula. So it's really different in that way. And there are over 200 described species in New Zealand, and some papers that have sampled soil thinks there are probably over 630 species present, or more. And there are over 250 species in Patagonia. And in both areas, they're kind of the most common genera in these southern beech forests. Another thing about them is they're often sequestered or truffle-like and fruiting above ground. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is kind of the most famous species from Patagonia, and it's a very beautiful purple species that grows all over the place. And now I'm just going to go through a bunch of photos so we can see some of the examples of this diversity in the genus. This is one of the truffle-like species in Patagonia. Another kind of intermediate form between becoming a truffle and just a normal guild mushroom. And there are just lots and lots of them. They're kind of everywhere, and most of them don't have names, and they're impossible to identify. Oh yeah. Thank you. Is that better?
Yeah.
Cool. I can go back a couple too. So, these are all quartz, and some of them don't really look like quartz to our northern hemisphere eyes. Like this kind of does. This looks like some of our red dye mushrooms.
Do they have brown spores like that?
They do, yeah. Some of these are kind of immature and you can't tell, but you can kind of see some. I think these have the same compounds for dyeing, but they're not necessarily super closely related to the northern hemisphere dermosity dye mushrooms. But I didn't hear anything about people dyeing with mushrooms down there. So there's some that you kind of look at and think, okay, that's probably a quart. Some very odd ones. This Cortinarius indolicus smells super strongly of mothballs, and you can barely pick it up. It's so slimy. That's just a slime layer. This one almost looks like a waxy cap, but you can see there are some brown spores developing. This is one of the yellow ones, and that red is KOH. So a lot of them have really beautiful KOH reactions. And just a lot of different ones. This one, you almost wouldn't think it's a quart at all. It's very odd, but yeah, so they just have a huge diversity of this genus in New Zealand. Some really beautiful purple ones. And they have a lot of colors that we don't really normally see in the northern hemisphere in Cortinarius. I don't know of any of the quartz down there that people eat. There are actually not very many edible mushrooms in New Zealand. There are 2 or 3 that people sometimes eat, but most of the people that go on foraging walks actually go into plantations of Monterey pine, and they look for Suillus and porcini and stuff like that. So there's not as much of a culture of eating mushrooms in New Zealand. Another very slimy one, that whole top part is the slime layer. And there's some really dramatic purples and beautiful colors. This is an interesting one that me and Christian found that has a white form and then a purple form, so it can be either.
Are those forms like different sexual stages, or do you know what they
Not sure, yeah. It's kind of more of a spectrum, like they could be white to purple.
How did you determine that? DNA analysis that they're identical?
Well, the first trip we didn't have any collection permits, so we were basically going off of literature, and Jerry Cooper is the mycologist for New Zealand. He's very active on iNaturalist and was telling us a lot of information, and we were every night going home and doing a bunch of research. But a lot of these species we just don't know. I think they determine that it's the same one that has two different forms from DNA. Yeah.
Do they have much of a culture of doing DNA analysis of the mushrooms that they find, or is it still morphological?
They do a lot of DNA work, and they have a foray there that's been going for 40 years. It's the only foray in the country, and the last 10 years or so, they've been taking specimens from the foray and sequencing them. And it's basically all run by this guy named Jerry Cooper. He kind of has all of the New Zealand mushrooms in his head, and he works for Landcare, which is the government research arm of the natural sciences, and he's done a ton of work publishing species and doing DNA barcoding and stuff like that. So there is a lot of work, there has been a lot of work done there, but there's also a lot more that we don't know. And Cordinaries have been worked on extensively by Carl Soup, who visited New Zealand several times and published a lot of species. And then they have a lot of species that have kind of a membranous partial veil instead of just a cortina. So, I mean, we only have one species like that in North America, Cordinarius caparatus, that has more of a veil, and they have dozens there. And then we'll get into the truffles. So a lot of these Cordinarius and other species kind of form these truffle-like or semi-truffle-like forms. So some of them still have fairly long stipes, but they have lost the ability to forcibly just discharge their spores. And some of them are more fully truffleized. This is kind of a spread of different morphologies they can take
Are
up.
they aromatic then? Are they strongly aromatic?
No.
No?
So,
How do they spread their spores if they're not signaling that
Well,
they're there?
we'll get into that in a sec, but the key is there are no mammals there.
Yeah.
So here are some other truffles that are not Cordinarius. This is an ascomycete. This is related to stinkhorns. This is a bolete truffle that's closely related to Lexinum. And this is kind of in the Hymenogasteraceae, are related to things like Galerina. So a lot of these species from very different orders, very different families have convergently evolved to form these really bright, not smelly above ground truffles. And why do we think that is? So they're colorful, they're fitting above ground, they're also visually similar to the fruits of many plants in New Zealand. So these are the fruits of one of the conifers there, and then these are a red truffle. So if you kind of take a step back, they look really similar. There are no rodents to distribute these spores to eat and poop out the truffle spores somewhere else, like in the Sierra Nevada. A lot of truffles in the Sierra Nevada are underground, they're really smelly, and the squirrels eat them for a large part of their diet and distribute the spores that way. So one of the theories, which is pretty hard to prove, is that many of the species of extinct flightless birds were eating these truffles either on purpose or not knowing they were truffles and thinking they were these fruits and then distributing them that way. They have found spores of some of the truffles. They found spores of this truffle, Rossbeavera, in the fossilized droppings of moa. And the moa are a 12-foot tall flightless bird that went extinct several hundred years ago. They were hunted to death because they were essentially really large, delicious chicken. And so here are just some of the flightless birds that are around today. This is a weka, and I kind of think of this as the raccoon version in New Zealand. Like they evolved into the niche of a raccoon. They kind of peck around your campsite and eat your food. This is the takahi, which is a critically endangered bird that eats tussock grass in like the high alpine of southern New Zealand. And tussock grass is like, you wouldn't want to eat that. It's very, very tough. And they basically just eat whole plants. And the kiwi, which some of you may know, this was taken at night with red light. And they forage around and eat worms out of the ground. They actually have organs at the end of their beak that can smell. So they're one of the only birds that can smell at the end of a long beak, so they reach down into the ground and sniff around. And this is what the moa looked like. They were extremely tall, and the idea is that maybe they were eating these truffles and distributing the spores around. I like to believe it for now just because it's fun. But there's not really a way that we can completely prove this. And that's a weka. They're very cute. Another niche in New Zealand that has interesting mushrooms is the broadleaf podocarp forest. So this is kind of on the west coast where it's a little bit more tropical and rainy. There are a lot of members of the Podocarpaceae, which is an ancient lineage of conifers that we don't have in the northern hemisphere. There aren't any ECM plants in that area, so we're looking at more of a diversity.
ECM.
Ectomycorrhizal. So it's similar to a redwood forest, where there are a lot of interesting decomposers and saprotrophic fungi. There are a lot of Clavaria, hygrosoby, entoloma, and geoglossum. I don't know if you guys have heard of the idea of chegg. It's those 4 families essentially grow together throughout the world, and we don't really have a good idea of why. They grow together in the redwood forests, they grow together in these New Zealand podocarp forests, and they grow together in England in the grasslands. So a lot of these habitats are kind of nutrient poor soils or weird. They don't have a lot of mycorrhizal plants around. And this is the habitat where you get a lot of unique and colorful mushrooms, such as, here's a couple examples of podocarps. This kind of almost looks like a redwood. And these forests are really dense and covered in vines and are much more diverse than the beech forests. They have a lot more plants. And with that, there are a lot of different kinds of wood and leaves to decompose, so you get a large diversity of interesting decomposers. These are all the members of the chegg group fruiting within 1 square foot. So this is the most famous New Zealand mushroom, Entoloma hochsteteri, the blue entoloma. And it's actually on the New Zealand $50 bill. And it's kind of culturally known, like people know this mushroom. And the Maori name for it is were were kokako. And the kokako is a bird with these blue wattles that are almost the same color as this. So the story of how that bird got its wattles and got its name was by touching the mushroom and developing these blue colors. And you get hygrosobies, you get waxy caps that are kind of similar looking to the ones here. And then some pretty amazing different kinds of waxy caps, some Gleophorus. And then you get species of hygrosoby that are really different from here. Some of these green ones blend in super well with the moss. A lot of these forests are just covered in moss, and there'll be mushrooms throughout the moss. You get earth tongues, and you get things like Hodophilus, or Hodophilus, which are actually related. They're in the same family as Clavaria, with these, and they fruit along with all these other species as well. And this is just another, I'm almost done, but this is an interesting thing. The Pseudobiospora, which is a group of tiny, colorful mushrooms, often grow alongside these chegg groups as well. And this is a species that has only been found in one hillside, and it was found by Christian and Noah when they went in 2019, I believe, and then found by Noah again, and then we found it again on the same hillside. So far it's only known from that one place. But maybe some of you guys will go and find another one. And that's all I have for now. I'm happy to have any questions. And that was a lot of information. Yeah.
So without animals, mammals do a great job
Yeah, I think there's
I mean, not just spores, but seeds as well, right?
right.
So like, do you have fewer fruiting trees?
Not necessarily. A lot of the mammals essentially evolved into or a lot of the birds evolved into the roles of mammals. So there is an endangered parrot that can't fly and climbs up trees and will eat the fruits off the trees. There are species that are ground dwelling that eat fruits. There are birds that fly, and they're kind of all evolving into or have evolved into the roles of mammals.
The birds don't fly because there are no mammal predators.
Right.
Like that they were allowed to proliferate because there were no mammal predators. That's
Basically, that's the idea. Is there were niches and they were filled by the birds instead of mammals.
okay.
Yeah.
But the ones that fly will probably be preyed upon by the other birds and they're like, come out here.
Well, the really large moa was preyed upon by the Haast eagle, which was the largest eagle to ever exist. It had somewhere around a 10 to 12 foot wingspan, and it would take out moa, and it would also take out kids, like Maori kids. So they would use a kid as basically a bait, and then the eagle would dive at it. It would jump. The kid would jump out of the way, and they would catch it and club it to death because they were like, taking kids from the villages. That bird's extinct now, but it was only within the last 600 years or so. Like they were around within the last 1,000 years. So people came from Polynesia, Maori. That was the original. Like New Zealand was one of the last places on Earth that people didn't inhabit. And when they arrived, they brought Polynesian rats, which are used for food, and those started kind of making some species go extinct. There was also a lot of burning of the landscape to create a place to live, and they brought food plants that they grew there. And then when European colonizers arrived, they introduced a lot more mammals and burned a lot more land, and a lot of birds went extinct from that. And so today there are some sanctuary islands where they've managed to make them predator-free. They've trapped all the mammals on the island, and some really rare and endangered birds live there, only on these sanctuary islands. Yeah, they're doing a pretty good job with conservation compared to a lot of places. But it's hard because if one species is introduced to this island, it can just go crazy.
Can you put the slide of similarities back up?
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that they found some of the spores of one of the ecologies fungi in the dung from the moa.
Yeah.
Did they find any spores of any fungi that they couldn't identify, maybe something that disappeared along with the moa?
I'm not sure about that. It is so recent that it's a little too early to know what impact the disappearance of the moa has, because if they were the main vectors for spore dispersal, then maybe those populations are more isolated now, but it's only been a couple hundred years, so I don't know. The idea is we can't really know yet what that's affecting. Yeah.
Will you be leading regular expeditions? I can't think of the word.
We're hoping to do more, yeah. Will we be leading more tours to New Zealand? We're hoping to. I think right now we're worried about gas prices and people probably not wanting to travel if things are so expensive. So we're going to keep an eye on that, and then hopefully in the future we can lead more, because it's really fun.
I can attest to that being really fun.
Did you go?
We did,
Yeah, Regan.
Do you have a favorite mushroom that you found on either of those trips, or like a mushroom you're really hoping to find maybe a plant or something?
Oh man. Well, the Brahmaculus, that tiny little Floriciboria relative, it was something that we were really excited to see this trip.
You have to understand when you're walking in the forest with Christian and Dean, you get like 25 feet into the forest and all of a sudden they're going, oh, wow! And they're diving down and they're looking at something that you need a magnifying glass to see. Teeny mushrooms. Anyway, it's amazing.
Yeah, like this trip that we went on this year, we were a little early for a lot of the places, so we also did have to go and look at the small stuff more. But on the trip that Phil was on, with some of these forests we walked into, and there were just mushrooms carpeting the place. And according to NOAA, that is not even close to the peak. Like some of these forests can just be more mushroom than soil.
And what time of the year is that? Like what month?
May is usually the peak because their seasons are reversed. So it's kind of early mid-fall. Yeah. But on a good year in the North Island, they can fruit into June or July as well. So they have a pretty long season depending on how the rains are.
So if you're only ever going to be able to do it once, you choose May.
Yeah, I think mid-May is like, you're good to go.
No tomorrow.
Have some of the mammals taken the place of the birds in eating the truffles and spreading the...
That's a good question. I'm not sure. And we also don't know for sure that the birds are doing that, because in some of the studies they've done, they've tried to observe the native birds eating the truffles, and they've preferred to eat non-native fungi. And you can imagine, like, if some of them are doing it every once in a while, it's really hard to capture on video or whatever, like one of these birds eating these truffles. So it's a fun theory that we're not really sure is true yet.
Are there deer?
There are deer that are introduced. Yeah. And now they're kind of there to stay because people love to hunt them there. Similarly, there are trout in the streams that were introduced, and now New Zealand is like a world-class fishing destination, all for non-native fish. And there are a bunch of native fish that people don't fish for that are being impacted by the introduced species. Yeah.
Are these species that you've shown all pretty much from the South Island, or are some of them from the North Island as well?
Both islands. We went to both islands. But I think both times we timed it a little better on the South Island, and we found a lot more fruiting there. We spent a little bit more time there. It just gets a lot of rain down in southern Fiordland, and around this time of year, there's almost always something there.
So the green mushroom that you showed, it's not chlorophyll that makes it green. They don't photosynthesis or anything like that.
Not chlorophyll. I'm not sure what pigment it is. It's probably, they're fairly closely related to the parrot mushrooms, the Gliophorus that are here, so maybe it's something similar to that.
Are these mycologist?
These are not, these are decomposers. Yeah.
I think you showed pictures from like the Argentinian side. Have you popped into Chile at all, the ground and mushrooms? Or?
No, I was only in the Argentinian side. Admittedly, this is mostly about New Zealand because I spent more time there. But yeah, I didn't go into the Chilean side. There are some really cool Chilean mycologists, and a lot of cool work is being done there, so it'd be really fun to go back. But yeah.
Are there any psilocybin mushrooms in New Zealand?
Yes. Let me see. I have a photo. There are, and some of them are similar to the ones we have here, and one of them is a truffle. So Psilocybe wearoa, which I think some people eat it, but apparently it has one of the highest cases of wood lovers paralysis of all the psilocybes. So.
Did you say wood lovers paralysis?
Yeah.
What's that?
Which you can't move for a while. I've heard. I think it comes back, but.
like a few hours a while, or like?
I think a few hours.
Pinocchio forever.
I don't know.
How would you compare it?
But this one is interesting. There was, at the foray, there was a Maori woman who was doing her master's on this mushroom. And basically the different iwi, or family groups in New Zealand, had very different views of this mushroom. So I'm forgetting the Maori name right now, but it roughly translates to house of God. And some of the family groups think of it as when you eat it, you become a house for God. And some of them think of it as like actually literally a little house for God that lives inside the mushroom. And some groups would eat this mushroom and consume it in kind of spiritual rituals, and some were really afraid of it and didn't touch it. It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
So are the Cortinarias mycorrhizal with the beach?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Do mushrooms taste differently over there?
Have not eaten a single mushroom from there.
One.
Oh, the agaricus you
Found
found?
that agaricus in the field.
Yeah, which is probably not native to New
This is
Zealand.
not native.
We found a horse mushroom, basically.
Yes.
Massive one in the field there.
Made fried rice with it.
Yeah, it was good. All right. Yeah.
What's the diversity of insects like in New Zealand? Is it just as diverse as here or somewhere else? So I'm thinking, did a project on psilocybin mushrooms. Nobody knows why they exist, right? But I wrote this paper on like they exist for that they co-evolve with any animal that has 5-HT receptors. It could be insects and any kind of mammal or thing. Anyway, so I'm curious because New Zealand doesn't have that many psilocybe, right? And they also didn't get people until the very last. So now I'm like, well, what about insects? They don't have 5-HT receptors.
Yeah, I think arthropods are probably a big factor in distributing the spores of these mushrooms. Actually, some of these Cortinarius, we were just noticing all of them had little exit holes from maybe a millipede or some kind of insect. So the insect diversity feels really similar to here. They don't have very many bitey insects except for sandflies, which some people experienced. Yeah.
Do they have banana flag?
No banana slugs. There are slugs there. A lot of them are introduced though. But yeah, they don't have banana slugs like the ones we do.
I noticed like in Santa Cruz, lots of banana flag eat mushrooms.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I think we saw slugs around mushrooms. I feel like probably they're also doing something with the spores, but I can't. They're not moving them that far. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you.